Jerome, it's just so good to have you here. And one thing I've learned from you, as a cognitive therapist, you help people change their perspectives on events in their life so that they're able to process through and be healed. So I began to think about my life because I was sexually molested from the time I was 2 years old to 9 years old. But those events shaped my whole future. It shaped how I thought, what I believed, how I responded. But at the exact same time, I realized I minimized those things. See, this was me being loved. I had to put a perspective on it so I could survive. This must make me valuable. This must make me acceptable. And as a child, I began, not consciously at that time, it was survival, but I look back now and realize how I minimized the intensity of injustice that was so that I could survive. And then when I was in my mid to late 30s, I began to have the realization of how horrifically unjust that was.
Yes.
And how damaging that was to my thoughts and my beliefs and the decisions that I made. And so then I had to process through my own healing by viewing those things in a way that was, all right, this is not going to destroy me. I'm not going to be a victim. I'm going to use this as a tool in my tool belt to help somebody else. So when you talked about a cognitive therapist being one that helps change perspectives, in just 2 seconds, I had an understanding of the journey of my life.
That's
so
amazing.
Could you feed into that?
Yes, that's amazing. Now that's a good process that you have gone through. Often people will need help to go through that process, but because you are quite self-reflective, knowing you assess where you're at and you understood that process and you have worked it through, and that's remarkable. Now, in your circumstances, it was a past event. Something like abuse often is a past event during a time of innocence where you are unable to affect change. And as you said, you minimized those experiences for survival.
Mm-hmm.
Now, then later when you found out, you were horrified. And I'm sure there were lots of emotions that ought to have been there before.
Definitely.
But if you did have them, as you said, you probably risked disapproval, discipline, and not even believed. So therefore, it is wonderful how you came to that place. Now, for some adults, they don't. So that's why they develop issues like depression or anxiety. Then they come to see someone like me. And through the process of conversation, these things come up and we understand that labeling. Now, in your situation, you minimize something that was there to cope. There are other times we actually exaggerate something. So, for example, typically in anxiety, we perceive danger. So when there is a danger perspective, and then the person thinks, I don't have the resources to cope with it, that is when somebody is going to have what we call a panic attack. And if that is there as a personality, we are going to have a generalized anxiety disorder. Or it can manifest in phobias. So the core of anxiety is an overestimation of danger and an underestimation of capability at the same time. So therefore, they cannot cope. So my work, my job in that context is to bring that and highlight that. So they're reducing that which they perceive as dangerous, say even to distressing. We can cope with distress, but we can't cope with danger. So if it is distressing, then we need less resources to cope with, personal resources, than if I said it was dangerous. So sometimes it comes through minimizing, through past events. Sometimes comes through overestimating. So whichever way it is, then we find a way to come to a place where things are better than what it was before as the first step of progress.
That is amazing. So as you were just sharing that, talk to me a little bit about like a label that we put on something.
Yes.
And that's my view or my perspective of something, and what I believe that event, the power that it has, or the lack of power it has in my life.
Yes. The labeling is very interesting. We label absolutely everything. If we do not give it a label, we will know what to do. Our behaviors follow labels. So, for example, I came and sat on this chair because I labeled it somewhere. I didn't stand up in front of the chair and say, this is a chair, this is where I need to sit on. No, I knew it was a chair, so my behavior follows it and sits down. So really, for us to do anything, we have to give it a label. So without a label, we cannot function. So you could say a cognitive meaning. So because of that, we tend to then evaluate and interpret events in our lives according to the label that we personally bring to. So for example, our culture can shape that. Our education can shape that. Our value systems can shape that. Our age and experience can shape that. So what do we call maturity? At one point, we labeled something that we think we can't do. And later, with new information, we changed our mind and changed our label. And then we would say we let go childish ways of looking at things, and we have taken on adult perspectives or more mature perspectives. So really labeling, there are some great, tremendous benefits of labeling, even though the general conversation of labeling is related to a negative connotation. So we label people. So usually the medics and people like my background are criticized to say somebody's a diabetic. So when the doctor sees the person, they see a diabetic than the individual. So we have to kind of be aware of that too, that you're treating the disorder than the person. So we could do that in life as well. Oh, so-and-so is an angry person. So we treat the disorder rather than the person. So there are so many things. So even prejudice and biases come from that place of labeling. So we look at the color or the caste or the social economic status or whatever it might be, then there the labeling doesn't work really well for the person or the other person concerned.
So we can have positive labels that literally shift how we think and view and act and believe and function.
Exactly. That's right. So we can, through when we look at all the civil rights movements, they shifted a label.
Yeah.
And people got hold of it and they realized this is a good thing and everybody went behind it, and then we have had amazing changes in our human history.
So if we can take something that we have so labeled negatively, that it brought fear, it brought, distress or depression, and we can begin to place a different label on that is not just more in line with reality, but it's separate from all the emotions and, the living by default type thing, just reacting, those knee-jerk reactions. If we can place a different label on there that is positive, then literally our actions will ultimately follow that positive label.
Correct. Indeed. So labeling has to be intentional.
It has to be intentional.
Consciously have to make a decision, because internally, because of our backgrounds and experience, we will have an automatic label that will come into it. And usually something, I can't cope with it, or I can't do it, it's too much to cope with. So I have to be conscious of it and recognize that is coming from my past experience, and then look at the situation as it is now and give it the label that almost accurately reflects what is going on, so that I have enough resources to bring into it.
So let's talk about prejudice just a moment. Yeah. So if I look at you and say, you're Indian, Asian, I might not know you're from Sri Lanka. And so I look at you and I say, I can't trust him. Correct. Or maybe I look at you and say, he's a man. Look what men did to me. So all men are bad. Yes. And so I have just labeled you. And so I react in fear. I react self-protectively. I'm ready to attack you, be angry at you, make judgments of you, correct? Yeah. But if I look at you and I say, I believe this is a good man. Yes. I'm going to give him an opportunity to prove himself trustworthy. Yes. And when I shift my label of you, not based upon your race, not based upon your gender, but on who you are in character, then I begin to shift internally what I believe and how I respond to you. Yes. Am I saying this correctly?
That is spot on. So, for example, it does not just bring wholeness to you in that context. Say, for example, if I have been affected by racism or prejudice, that attitude will also heal me to know this person actually views me just as I am. She's not taking my color into account. She's not taking my nationality into account. She sees me just as I am. So it's a two-way process when we begin to acknowledge those prejudices, those biases, and we just treat a label to shifting it to be treating people.
So the bottom line is we make a conscious, intentional choice
Yes.
to put a right label on something,
Yes.
so our actions follow that.
Correct.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Did you have something else to say?
Yes, because our emotion may not change immediately, but that's okay. But keep rehearsing the new conscious, intentional meaning to the context. As you keep rehearsing that, your emotion will follow.
So instead of having this knee-jerk automatic pattern of thought, the more we rehearse it, it'll change
Yes.
our very way of thinking.
Correct. Indeed. Indeed. Because the new way of thinking will bring rewards, will reinforce a new behavior, will recognize then that which was initially extrinsic will become an intrinsic reward.
Yeah.
It feels good to be able to go beyond the labels and work with people, and that reward will then firmly cement it that this is a good label to be repeated, to be continued, and to be passed on.
So we can get rid of every label that says we are powerless, because we are extremely powerful. Thank you so much.